The mop bucket had a broken wheel. It had been broken for 6 weeks. Every night, Elena Vasquez dragged it across the linoleum of St. Augustine Medical Center's emergency department corridor with a rhythmic, grinding screech, left wheel catching, skipping, dragging, a sound so consistent and so ignored that the overnight staff had stopped hearing it entirely. Like the hum of the ventilation system, like the beeping of monitors in rooms where no one was dying yet. Elena didn't report the broken wheel. She didn't fill out a maintenance request. She simply compensated, tilting the bucket slightly to the right, redistributing the weight, absorbing the drag in her left shoulder. She had adapted to worse, far worse. She was 41, though she looked older in the unforgiving fluorescent light. Her dark hair was pulled back under a grey cleaning cap. Her uniform, pale green, the colour of old institutional walls, spotless at the start of a shift and systematically destroyed by the end. She walked close to walls. She made eye contact with no one. When spoken to, she answered in the fewest possible words. The overnight staff called her Ghost. Not to her face. To her face, the ones who acknowledged her at all called her Elena, or sometimes just Hey. But in the break room, in the hushed conversations over cold coffee at 2 a.m., she was Ghost, the woman who appeared and disappeared, who cleaned up the blood and the bile and the wreckage of human catastrophe without a sound and without complaint, and who was always somehow already gone before you turned around to thank her. She had worked the overnight shift at St. Augustine for 3 years. Prior to that, nothing traceable. The HR file for Elena Vasquez contained a social security number that checked out, a clean background check, a valid Ohio driver's license, and a note from a previous HR director. References verified by federal contractor. Do not pursue further. No one had. She arrived at 10:47 p.m. every shift, 13 minutes early. She clocked in, retrieved her cart and her broken-wheeled bucket from the supply closet on sub-level 2, and began her circuit. She knew every square foot of St. Augustine's overnight geography with the intimate tactical precision of someone who had memorized it not as a map but as a terrain, which tiles squeaked, which corridor lights flickered, which hallway angles were blind to the nursing stations. She cleaned, she mopped, she emptied biohazard bins. She restocked paper towels in bathrooms that smelled of industrial soap and fear. She was invisible. She intended to remain invisible. Elaine Cross arrived on a Tuesday. The announcement had come 2 weeks prior, a memo distributed by the hospital's parent corporation, MedCore Health Systems, to all department heads. Subject line, Operational Excellence Initiative. Body text, a great deal of corporate language about streamlining, efficiency metrics, and non-core personnel overhead. The memo had been passed around the break room with varying degrees of alarm depending on whether the reader was a physician, a nurse, or support staff. Physicians had skimmed it and set it down. Nurses had read it twice with growing unease. The support staff, the aides, the orderlies, the cleaning crew, had read it in silence and said nothing, because people in their position had learned that saying nothing was the safest available option when the word overhead appeared in proximity to the word non-core. Elaine Cross was 47, slim and precise in the manner of someone who had made precision into a personal aesthetic. She wore dark charcoal suits exclusively, kept her blonde hair in a severe chignon, and carried a tablet at all times displaying a cascade of spreadsheets that she consulted with the focused reverence of a person reading sacred text. She had no medical background. She had been brought in by MedCore's board to cut costs. Her first official act at St. Augustine was to schedule a facility walkthrough at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, specifically to observe overnight operational efficiency. She arrived with 2 aides carrying clipboards and a facilities manager named Doug, who looked like he hadn't slept in several days. Elena was mopping the corridor outside Trauma Bay 2 when they came around the corner. Elaine Cross stopped. She looked at Elena. She looked at the mop bucket with its broken wheel, still listing slightly to the right. She looked at her tablet. "Is this the overnight cleaning staff?" she asked Doug, not looking at him. "Yes, ma'am. Elena Vasquez. She's been with us 3 years." Elaine made a notation on her tablet. "1 person for this entire corridor network?" "On this wing, yes. There are 2 others on the east side of the building." Another notation. And the equipment condition. She gestured at the bucket with the erect, minimal movement of someone who finds pointing distasteful. That wheel is broken. Yes, ma'am. Maintenance request has been. Has it been submitted? Doug looked at Elena. Elena said nothing. She had not submitted a maintenance request. She had adapted. It will be addressed, Doug said. Elaine Cross looked at Elena directly for the first time. Elena met her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then returned her eyes to the mop. She had learned, a long time ago, in contexts Elaine Cross could not have imagined, that sustained eye contact was an invitation to escalation. What's your efficiency rating? Elaine asked her. Elena looked up again. I clean the floors, she said. Elaine blinked. Your output metric. Square footage completed per shift versus benchmark. I don't know the benchmark, Elena said. A notation, a very deliberate notation. We'll be reviewing support personnel allocations this week, Elaine said, more to Doug than to Elena. Non-clinical overhead is running at 31% above the MedCore network average. That's not sustainable. She turned and walked back the way she had come, her aides trailing behind her, clipboards pressed to their chests like shields. Doug stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at Elena with an expression caught between apology and helplessness. I'll put in the maintenance request for the wheel, he said quietly. It's fine, Elena said. She went back to mopping. The review took 9 days, a series of optimization meetings during which efficiency metrics were applied to human beings with the dispassionate thoroughness of a cost-benefit analysis. Support staff hours were cross-referenced against patient outcome data. Cleaning schedules timed against foot traffic studies. The overnight crew was informed that MedCore's standard called for a 22% reduction in non-clinical hours. Elena received her notice on a Thursday. Effective in 2 weeks, her shift would be cut from 8 hours to 5. The reduction in pay would be proportional. There was no appeal process noted in the paperwork. She read the notice in the supply closet, standing under a single bare bulb. She folded it twice, put it in the pocket of her uniform, and went back to work. Dr. Raymond Chu, the overnight attending in the ER, found her mopping outside his office at 1:15 a.m. and stopped in the doorway. Chu was 53, steady, unspectacular, in the way that genuinely good emergency physicians often were. No dramatic flair, no ego architecture, just a deep and durable competence that had kept people alive for 27 years. You hear about the cuts? He asked. Yes, Elena said. You going to be okay? She looked at him. Of all the overnight staff, Chu was the only one who had ever asked her a question that wasn't about a spill or a supply. I'll manage, she said. He nodded slowly. I put in a note to administration. For the record, said the overnight cleaning standard has a direct infection control impact. He paused. They acknowledged receipt. That's all. Thank you, Elena said. She meant it, which was not something she said often. He went back into his office. She finished the corridor and moved on to the next one, her bucket grinding and skipping beside her in the dark. The following Monday, Elaine Cross held a department head meeting and presented a slide deck. The final slide read, Phase 2, Support Staff Restructuring, Implementation beginning Q4. In the hallway outside the conference room, word traveled the way it always does in hospitals, not through official channels, but through the capillary network of break-room whispers and elevator conversations. By noon, the cleaning crew knew that Phase 2 meant a further reduction and that restructuring almost certainly meant terminations rather than just hour cuts. Elena heard this from a woman named Consuela, 9 years on the day shift, crying quietly into a paper cup. Elena refilled her coffee. That was what she could actually do. She went back to work. It was a Thursday night, 11 days after the notice. The kind of night ER staff everywhere know by instinct. The air pressure slightly wrong, the lull too quiet. The feeling before. It manifested at 2:17 a.m. Elena was in the supply corridor adjacent to the main ER floor, restocking a cleaning cart, when she heard the overhead PA system produce the specific triple chime that preceded a mass casualty alert. She stopped moving. Code Orange, all available personnel to emergency. Code orange, mass casualty incoming. All available personnel. She heard it. She counted. 3 seconds of silence after the announcement. Then the ER floor erupted, the sound carrying through the supply corridor walls, through the push-bar door, into the air around her. Monitors, voices, the crash of equipment being repositioned, the squeal of gurney wheels. She did not move toward the door. She stood at the supply cart, hands still, listening. A collapsed parking structure attached to a concert venue 4 miles away. This would come out later, in full. For now, through the door, through the wall, she heard numbers being called out. Incoming count, incoming injuries. Her mind, without permission, began its own triage. She had done this before. Her brain simply ran the process, involuntary as breathing. She pushed the supply cart against the wall, straightened it precisely so it wouldn't block the corridor, and opened the push-bar door. The ER floor was controlled chaos, which is to say it was chaos with the architecture of training imposed over it. People moving fast but not randomly, every movement toward a purpose, even when the purpose was wrong. Elena stepped in and stood against the wall just inside the door, completely still, and looked. 7 incoming, the radio said. Now it said 9. Crush injuries, they said. Blunt trauma, they said. A child, someone said. The word rising above the other words because it always did. The first gurneys hit the doors at 2:24 a.m. Elena watched. She catalogued. This was not a conscious decision. It was what she was. The first 3 patients were adults. Bad, all of them, but adults, with adult physiology and the volumes of blood that meant you had some margin. The 4th gurney carried the child. He was approximately 8 years old. The paramedic calling the handoff was saying, crush injury, thoracic, tension pneumo-developing, airway compromised, and Dr. Chu was already moving, and there were 2 residents moving, and the monitor was going on, and the voices were rising, and in the middle of it, clearly, Elena heard something that the others apparently had not registered yet. The child had stopped making noise, not the blessed quiet of sedation, the specific, terrifying silence of a patient who has lost the energy to fight for air and is beginning to lose the fight entirely. Chu heard it a second later. He's tiring out, airways going. He reached for a laryngoscope. His resident reached for a pediatric tube. Standard protocol, right move, except Elena could see, from her angle, from the door, what neither of them could see from where they were standing. The angle of the child's neck, the way the trachea had deviated, the subtle asymmetry of his chest wall with each labored attempt. Tension pneumo is worse than the airway, Elena said. The room didn't stop, but Chu's hands paused for half a second and he looked up and looked at her, at the cleaning woman standing inside the door, and his eyes were a physician's eyes, which meant he was already recalculating even as his face registered the incongruity of the source. Right side, Elena said, tracheal shift. You tube him first, you buy 30 seconds and lose him anyway. 1 second, 2, the monitor screamed. Chu made his decision. Needle decompression, right second intercostal, he said to his resident, already pivoting. Now, move. Elena walked to the supply cart along the wall, not running, walking, the same deliberate pace she used for everything, and had the 14-gauge angiocath in her hand and was placing it on the edge of the bay before the resident had fully processed the order. The resident stared at her. Chu took the angiocath without looking at who had handed it to him. The hiss of escaping air was audible across the bay. The child's chest rose, both sides evenly. The monitor's scream shifted register, still alarming, still urgent, but no longer the particular pitch that meant imminent. Chu intubated quickly, cleanly, the airway cooperative now that the pressure was off. The child's oxygen saturation began, slowly, to climb. Chu stepped back. He looked at Elena. She was already moving back toward the wall. Wait, he said. Wait. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment in the chaotic, loud, fluorescent bright room. Where did you? He started. You had it, she said. I just had a better angle. She went back through the push-bar door into the supply corridor. She stood there for a moment in the quiet. Her hands were completely steady. Her heart rate had elevated during the process and was now returning to baseline with the smooth efficiency of a well-maintained system. She picked up the cleaning cart and moved it back into position. Through the door, she could hear the controlled chaos continuing, reorganizing itself around the new information, the crisis not over but stabilized at its worst point. She went back to work. Dr. Chu said nothing to administration. Elena had made clear with her eyes before she went through the door that she preferred he didn't. He was a physician of long experience and he had learned, among other things, to read what people communicated without words. He charted the decompression under his own name. Standard procedure. He lay awake until 6 a.m. thinking about what he'd seen. What he'd seen, a cleaning woman who had diagnosed a tension pneumothorax from across a chaotic room in deteriorating light, had retrieved the correct instrument without being asked, and had then walked back to her mop, as if she'd done nothing more remarkable than emptying a waste bin. He did not pursue it, but he didn't forget it either. 11 days later, Elaine Cross distributed the Phase 2 notice. Elena Vasquez was among 14 support staff members listed for termination, effective at the end of the month. The notice cited position elimination due to restructuring, rather than performance, which was the correct legal language and also a precise inversion of the truth. Elena received the notice on a Friday. She read it in the supply closet, under the same bare bulb, and folded it twice, and put it in her pocket, and went back to work. She had 4 shifts remaining. She used all of them. The night it happened was her second to last shift. 2:51 a.m., a Thursday. Elena was in the east corridor, the one with the flickering light, running her mop in long even strokes, when she heard the sound that she had not heard since a time and a place she did not permit herself to revisit in any detail. She heard it before she understood that she had heard it, the way the body sometimes processes threat information before the conscious mind has caught up. A door opened wrong, not the controlled push of someone moving through a space with a purpose. The specific, taut sound of a door opened by someone in a state of controlled aggression who is trying to manage the noise of their own movement and not entirely succeeding. She stopped mopping. She listened. 3 seconds. Then voices. One loud, jagged-edged, male, not the voice of a patient in pain, but the voice of a person exerting control. Then multiple voices, lower, frightened, the particular pitch of people who have understood very quickly that the normal rules of the environment no longer applied. Elena set her mop against the wall with extreme care, making no sound. She moved to the corner of the corridor and looked around it. The man was in the ER waiting room. He had come through the ambulance bay door, which meant he had come through a door that should have required a keycard, which meant either the door had been left propped, which happened, or he had followed someone through it closely enough that the latch hadn't caught, which also happened. He was perhaps 35, wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild night, and he was holding a handgun in a 2-handed grip that was practiced enough to mean he had used it before, or trained with it, or both. He had 14 people on the floor. Nurses, a resident, 2 paramedics who had been completing their handoff paperwork, a security guard whose radio was on the floor beside him. The security guard was conscious but not moving, which was good. Moving would have made things worse. Elena observed all of this in the time it took her to process the geometry of the room. She pulled back around the corner. She pressed her back against the wall. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she ran the numbers that she had been trained to run, and had run, in conditions she was not going to think about right now. The room's exits, the man's position relative to each, the positions of the hostages, the distance from where she was standing to the ambulance bay entrance, the location of the hospital's secondary security station on sub-level 1, which she knew from 3 years of walking these corridors in the dark, was staffed by 1 guard on overnight who had a landline direct to the city's emergency dispatch. She registered that the situation would resolve one of 2 ways: professional intervention that would take time she wasn't sure existed, or her. She chose, the way she had always chosen, in the end. She moved. The secondary security station was reached via the stairwell at the end of the east corridor, down one floor. Elena moved through the dark quickly and without sound, not running but with a pace that covered distance faster than it appeared to, a particular kind of movement that she had developed over years, in environments where running announced your position and stillness meant death, and the only viable option was to be faster than the eye expected from someone moving the way she was moving. She hit the stairwell door and went down. The guard at sublevel 1 was a man named Patrick, 58, retired city police. He was reading a paperback when Elena came through the door. He looked up. He began to say something and then stopped, because something about the way she was standing, some quality of her stillness that he could not articulate in the incident report, made the question die in his throat. Active shooter, waiting room, ER level, Elena said. 14 hostages. 1 firearm, handgun, 2-handed grip. Shooter positioned north side of room, 10 to 12 feet from the ambulance bay door. Security guard is down but conscious. You need to call dispatch now and you need to tell them not to breach the ambulance bay door. The door opens inward and the shooter is directly in the line of sight. Patrick stared at her. Now, she said, not loud, just absolute. He picked up the phone. Elena said, tell them to hold position outside. Tell them not to breach. Tell them to give me 11 minutes. Patrick had the phone to his ear and dispatch was already picking up and he said, later, that he relayed the message because something in the quality of her voice made it not a request but a statement of fact, and he had been in law enforcement long enough to know the difference. 11 minutes, he said into the phone. Elena was already back through the door and up the stairs. She retrieved her mop handle from the east corridor wall. It was 42 inches of dense hardwood, broom handle gauge. She had carried it for 3 years. She knew its weight and balance the way she knew her own hands. She moved to the ambulance bay entrance, not the main sliding doors that the shooter was watching, but the secondary bay door on the south side, the one that the overnight paramedics used to cut time off their handoffs, and that was, as she had noted 11 months ago when she'd first mapped this level, not visible from the shooter's current position due to the angle of the triage desk and the placement of a ceiling-mounted monitor bank. She tried the handle. It opened. The latch hadn't caught properly on the last exit, which she had known was a possibility because she had watched the paramedics rush exit 20 minutes earlier, and she had noted, in the automatic inventory she ran on everything around her, that he had not checked the latch. She went in. What happened next took 8 minutes and 40 seconds. This would be established later, precisely, by the timestamp correlation between Patrick's dispatch call and the all-clear signal. The after-action reconstruction would note, Elena entered via the south ambulance bay door, used the blind angle of the triage desk to cross without triggering the shooter's awareness, disabled his weapon arm via a joint lock consistent with military combatives, and had him immobilized before any of the 14 hostages had fully processed what was happening. The SWAT team, holding outside per the dispatch instruction, received the all-clear at 3:09 a.m. They came in to find 14 people sitting on the floor of the waiting room in various states of shock. A man face down on the linoleum with his hands secured behind him using the cord from a blood pressure cuff, and Elena Vasquez standing 4 feet away, holding a mop handle, looking at the door. The SWAT team commander, a man named Briggs who had been doing this for 19 years, stopped when he came through the door and looked at the scene, and then looked at the woman in the pale green janitor's uniform and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is anyone injured?" "The security guard on the floor took a blow to the head before I arrived," Elena said. "He's conscious and coherent. He should be evaluated for concussion." Briggs looked at her for another moment. "And you?" "Fine," Elena said. She set the mop handle carefully against the wall. By 4 a.m., the ER was a different kind of chaos, the controlled, procedural chaos of aftermath. Police, administrators called in from home, hospital security supplemented by city officers, the 14 hostages being interviewed in small groups, the shooter in police custody and on his way to booking. Dr. Chu was among the staff who had been on the floor. He had been at the rear of the waiting room when it started, had done exactly what he should do, which was stay low and keep the others calm. He found Elena at 4:15 a.m., standing in the east corridor with her mop, running it in long, even strokes. He stood in the corridor and looked at her. "Elena," he said. She stopped mopping and looked at him. "What are you?" he asked. It was not a rude question. It was the only precise question. She considered him for a moment. "I clean floors," she said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at the mop. "I know," she said. She went back to work. Elaine Cross arrived at 7 a.m., 2 hours ahead of her normal schedule, having been called by the hospital's CEO. She walked through the ER with the expression of someone calculating the liability implications of every object in her field of vision. She was briefed by the administrator on duty, by the police liaison, and by a very tired Doug from facilities. She was informed that a member of the overnight cleaning staff had disarmed and immobilized a gunman who had taken 14 hospital employees hostage. She asked which member. She was told Elena Vasquez. Elaine Cross was quiet for a moment. "The one on the termination list," she said. "Yes," said Doug. Another quiet moment. "Well," she said, "that changes the optics somewhat." She opened her tablet. "I'll need to review the liability exposure of employing someone with that kind of—" "She's the reason 14 of your employees aren't dead," Chu said from across the room. He had not gone home. He was standing by the nurse's station with a cold cup of coffee, and he was looking at Elaine Cross with the calm, unblinking regard of a man who had been awake for 31 hours and had passed through the threshold where social filtering still operated. Whatever she is, whatever she was, she is the reason. Elaine Cross looked at him. She looked at her tablet. She made no notation. At 9:17 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled into the main entrance loop. The drivers remained in the vehicles. 6 people got out, 4 in civilian suits that communicated federal employment without advertising it, and 2 in military uniform. The 2 in uniform were a lieutenant colonel and a full colonel. Sandra Reyes, lean, 60, close-cropped silver hair, commanding officer of a unit whose name was not on any public organizational chart. They were met at the entrance by the hospital CEO, a man named Peterson, who had driven in at 5 a.m. and had not yet had time to properly manage his alarm into administrative composure. "Colonel Reyes," Peterson said, because he had been briefed, in the hour before their arrival, by a phone call from a number he did not recognize, in terms that he was still processing. "Mr. Peterson," Reyes said, "we're here for Elena." "Of course," Peterson said. "Of course, yes, she's—" "We know where she is," Reyes said. "We'd like a room, and we'd like the relevant administrative personnel present, including whoever made the termination decision." Peterson looked at the lieutenant colonel. The lieutenant colonel looked at his clipboard. Peterson said, "I'll arrange it." The conference room on the second floor was assembled in 22 minutes. Present, Peterson, the CFO, 2 board members, Elaine Cross with her tablet, Doug from facilities, Dr. Chu who had refused to leave, and 3 department heads who had been called without full explanation. Elena was brought in last, by Patrick from sub-level security, who had insisted on being the one to walk her up. She was still in her pale green uniform. She had completed her shift. She had been asked, very politely, and with slightly more urgency than the politeness entirely concealed, to stay. She sat at the end of the conference table and looked at the people in the room, and looked at the 2 military officers standing against the wall. She looked at Colonel Reyes. Something passed between them, not words, not gestures, just a recognition, the particular recognition of people who have operated in the same world. "Elena," Reyes said. "Sandra," Elena said. Elaine Cross looked up from her tablet. Colonel Reyes addressed the room. "The woman you have been employing as an overnight janitor for the past 3 years," she said, with the measured, unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to briefing rooms, "is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez, United States Army Special Forces Command." She is currently on an administrative status that has required her to maintain a low-profile civilian existence, the details of which are classified and will remain classified. What I am authorized to tell you is this." She paused. The room was completely silent. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez served 4 deployments in special operations environments. She holds the Silver Star, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and the Combat Medical Badge. She was the commanding officer of a covert forward surgical team operating in classified theaters from 2009 through 2016, during which time her unit performed 847 field surgical interventions with a survival rate of 91.3% under combat conditions. In 2016, she was placed in a protected administrative status following an operation that resulted in significant risk to her personal safety. She chose this facility and this position herself, 3 years ago, for reasons that were approved by her chain of command." End quote. Elaine Cross had stopped typing. Her tablet was in her lap. She was staring at Elena. "Last night," Reyes continued, "Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez neutralized an armed threat to 14 hospital personnel, using no equipment, beyond improvised tools, sustained no injury, secured the weapon, and maintained the safety of all 14 individuals in her care." She paused again. "She also, 11 days ago, provided a diagnostic observation that your overnight attending has confirmed was directly responsible for the survival of a pediatric patient in respiratory failure. She did this from across a room, without equipment, while employed as a cleaning worker." Dr. Chu looked at Elena. Elena looked at the table. "The termination notice issued to Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez," Reyes said, and her eyes moved to Elaine Cross, "will be rescinded today. Additionally, the Army will be requesting a formal review of the restructuring decisions that led to this notice, as they pertain to the welfare of personnel under our administrative oversight. That review will be conducted in coordination with MedCorps Health Systems Corporate Compliance Office." She looked at Peterson. "I've already spoken to your general counsel." Peterson nodded. He looked like a man who had nodded his way through more of this morning than he had expected to have to nod through. Elaine Cross said, very carefully, "The restructuring decisions were made in accordance with standard efficiency." "Yes," Reyes said. "I'm sure they were." The 2 words contained an entire editorial. Then Reyes looked at Elena directly, and the room fell quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of information being absorbed, but the quiet of something more personal. "We've been trying to bring you back for 8 months," she said. "Command wants you. There are people who need you." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware," she said. "And?" Elena looked at her hands. The hands that had held a mop handle, and before that a scalpel, and before that instruments of a precision and consequence that she did not think about in the East Corridor at 3 a.m., because thinking about them would have made the East Corridor at 3 a.m. impossible to inhabit. "I need more time," she said. Reyes studied her. "How much more?" "I don't know," Elena said. It was the most honest thing she had said in 3 years. Reyes nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "but the offer doesn't expire." She looked around the room one more time. Her eyes rested briefly on Elaine Cross, then moved on, dismissing her from consideration with the absolute economy of someone who had no time for things that were no longer relevant. "She stays," Reyes said. "She works whatever hours she works. Her equipment is maintained." A look at Doug. "The wheel on the mop bucket gets fixed today." She picked up her cover from the table and tucked it under her arm. "Gentlemen, Ms. Cross." She and the lieutenant colonel left the room. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Elaine Cross said, in a voice that had lost some of its precision, "I'll need to revisit the restructuring projections." Nobody responded. Dr. Chu was looking at Elena. Elena was looking at the door that Reyes had just walked through. "The kid," Chu said, "from the parking structure. He's going to be okay. They moved him out of the ICU this morning." Elena looked at him. Something moved across her face. Brief, controlled, the closest she came to expression in the open. "Good," she said. She stood up. She smoothed her pale green uniform. She picked up the folded termination notice from her pocket. She had brought it with her, some habit of carrying documentation, and she set it on the table. She walked out of the conference room. She went to the supply closet on sub-level 2, retrieved her cart, and retrieved the mop bucket. The wheel had not been fixed yet. That would happen later, when the maintenance request that Doug filed at 9:47 a.m. was processed. But by the time she had pushed the cart to the elevator and pressed the button for the main floor, the familiar grinding screech had started, the left wheel catching and skipping in its broken rhythm. She tilted the bucket slightly to the right. She redistributed the weight. She absorbed the drag in her left shoulder. She went back to work. Outside, in the main entrance loop, the 3 black SUVs were still there. Colonel Reyes was standing beside the rear vehicle, not looking at the hospital, looking at her phone. As the SUV windows came down, the lieutenant colonel said something to her. She nodded once, precise and final, and got in. The vehicles left. The morning shift was starting. The ER was filling with the ordinary catastrophes of the day, the chest pains and the broken bones, and the fevers and the fear. Gurneys moved, monitors beeped. Someone was crying in Bay 3. Elena mopped the corridor outside Trauma Bay 2, where the child had been brought 11 days ago, where the floor had been cleaned and re-cleaned since then, but where she still knew, from the precise geometry of the room, exactly where she had stood and exactly what angle she had needed. The mop moved in long, even strokes, left, right, left, right. The bucket wheel caught and skipped and dragged. She worked. If you watched this story of silent strength and buried identity and felt it land somewhere deep, hit that like button. Because the people carrying the heaviest histories are often the ones mopping the floors, and they deserve to be seen. Share this with someone who believes in quiet heroes. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that go beneath the surface. And drop a comment. Would you have trusted her before you knew?